Hello, everybody. My name is Monika Jaeckel. I'm an independent artist researcher currently located in Berlin, Germany. The title of my presentation is Listening as Act of Responsibility. This presentation focuses on my recent performance-based research project, Reverberating Interferences, Explorations into Thingness, to point at and explore further what was also the experiment's core theme, listening. It establishes an inquiry if noise can enable a more balanced interaction with other matter and its knowings, and facilitate a system change with and towards the disregarded, suppressed, or simply denied. Being structured around the elements of situatedness, movement, and interference, I expound the general importance of the notion of listening within the project, but also explore to what extent the reached out for could be achieved, which constraints became apparent, and where my intentions implied the wrong impetus. As a second crucial notion, responsibility has therefore been applied to our limited result to critically interrogate what types of responses we were able to perceive, to give, and to acknowledge. The following, however, is already based on further readings due to interest evoked through these gained experiences. Regarded as a journey into that what my horizon limits me to see and or hear, failure was considered part of this exploration into the unknown or yet unknowable. I will now play a short sequence of the performance turned film, about 3 minutes.
We took some advice from Mary Oliver's poem, Wild Geese, by following the soft call of the body, letting it love what it loves, attuning to its movements, sensations, and effects, hoping that the complexity of physical experience reveals unforeseen insights. Sounds and voices of something unpredictable. Being able to hear the harsh and exciting call of other critters and things may allow to find a place among them. Recognizing one's belonging within the planetary family of things. Particularly for the us who imagines to be exceptional. Affirmative listening reveals entanglement. Perceiving the other as being partners evokes discern for the effects of our moves. This interweaving thread connects also what we dislocate as non-us situations. In being with and among things, it becomes anticipated. Such complementary demands neither acts of inclusion nor exclusion.
Okay, I stop here. Considering listening on the level of affectivity means not only to affect, but also to be affected. Consequently, listening must be understood, quote, as an ecology in which we are not only listening, but listen to, quote, end, by Robinson. In the inevitable relation to situatedness, that listening always implicates, this generically involves a structured and built, the social and cultural, or the so-called natural, which is the cultured environment. This radical situatedness of sounds and listening therefore provides an important point of access and correspondence for the thinking through and with a new materialist-induced attempt of unlearning. Such a point of view, which tendencies of a critical post-human understanding must then take into regards that the naming for the current area as the Anthropocene has to be realized in its full meaning as human impacted. Geological features are undoubtedly important for fixing this new era stating within the prevailing frame of knowledge production. But as Lewis and Maslin point out, the determination of an official dating will have numerous philosophical, social, economic, and political repercussions. The two possible dates Lewis and Maslin suggest both indicate an Eurocentric impetus of development, with one implying that colonialism, global trade, and coal brought about the Anthropocene, while the other marking a story of an elite-driven technological development. The two dates have also been brought forward by writers and thinkers concerned with feminist physics, racist philosophical, and materialist geological aspects, such as Karen Barad, Sylvia Wynter, and Katrin Yusuf. Winter's point that locates the beginning of Europe's rise as a dominating knowledge producer in the racism introduced by colonialism about 1492 is supported by Yusuf's geological reading of terraforming. Barad, though, asked for a different sense of temporality that could hold the positioning of such historical markers as to live inside each other, 1492 as inside 1945, for example, and vice versa. This important insight locates positionality not just in space, but also in time, providing another aspect of what Dylan Robinson calls the background hum of positionality. And here could also probably be assigned Mary Thompson's definition of the inaudible but effective background. Defined this way, the term positionality thus clearly indicates a different space-time mattering that layers each situation for its various inhabitants, participants differently, and thereby foreclosing interpretations of universalizing re-interpretations. In this regard, Robinson's critical positionality subverts definitions of colonial listening habits by assuming an extended approach to affectivity that, as stated above, includes a mutual effectiveness that does not mean the same for and of the various side, things, and people involved. To clarify his form of understanding, Robinson activates Edward Said's structural appliance of the musical concept of the counterpoint, which intends both reciprocity of recognition and principled antagonism that allows each doing its own thing within the structured totality. Yet while this opens a possibility towards an understanding of the we in the Anthropocene as non-universal, but rather in a pluriversal sense of multiple we's, it does not yet assume the voice of other matterings as suggested in new materialism's interpretation. However, as Robinson points out, this has long been a quotidian fact of indigenous lives and epistemologies. Motion, aside of its many features, is also essential to the emergence and experience of sound, and it grounded the conceptual framework rationalizing my recent projects. Likewise, for the practical orientation, the methodological focus was set towards the patterns of movement and counter-movements caused by bodies, human and non-human, as intertwined indeterminacy, inciting the uncertainty of change. Motion can be abstracted by its relation to wave patterns that diffractively intersect like sound, that is experienced as a vibration, as motion, as something subject to attack and decay. The experiment of the performance attempt was to make these perceivable, in this case audible, to emphasize the responsibility of and towards the situation and the environment. In a certain way, the project attempted what the acoustic palimpsest metaphor developed by Daughtry encourages to do by thinking, quote, of audible phenomena as complexly layered and to imagine the traces of human activities that have been silenced, quote end. By extending voicing abilities towards non-human layerings, the project assumed that whether acknowledged or ignored, the interferences are expressions of human and non-human planetary others, which encompass all mattering forms. Motion and its subsequent iterative forms range from active expressions to forms of decay, manifesting the general inevitability and immanence of interferences. Considering, however, the incitement as being nudged by human action, as the naming of the Anthropocene suggests, opens toward two important aspects. Clearly then, even in accordance with current dominant interpretations of human agency as one-sided, these interference patterns are not arbitrary expressions, but an effect of prior activities. Thus, these reverberations must be assigned within the realm of response that is influenced, constrained, and directed by the space provided or taken for unfolding. It is therefore that these reverberations need to be addressed and acknowledged as full and regular responses, so eventually mutated by the imposed regulation and negation. The research considered these noises as a voicing that is opaque, but by no means negligible, rather implying that what Western modernity's metaphysics has claimed as non-belonging and inconsequential nevertheless matters in its redirected forms. The project, addressing Western modernity's definitions of agency within an interdisciplinary frame, generally acknowledged its positionality within the dominant knowledge production and attempted to address a shift away from a one world view towards a pluriversal approach, emphasizing new materialism's notion of situatedness, in this case within Western modernity's metaphysics, crucially establishes an opacity where the researchers, that is also the performers, must confront their inability to classify things outside of their educational ken or cultural framework. In his resonant theory for indigenous sound studies, Robinson argues for such a reorientation towards different frameworks of perception, generally demanding an interruption of the unidirectional, quote, dichotomy between music's limited agency as passive object and the listener as the active partner, quote end. Taking a critical positionality importantly discerns the dismissed subaltern categorizations of the de and inhuman as crucially questioning Western metaphysics because it provokes the question, how can we, that is those educated in this universalizing vein, come to engage with other knowledges without further appropriating them via our inherited way of thinking. The notion of noise thus became an experimental indicator of the unknown or ignored for the performative experiments. In information theory, noise increases the variability of information of any kind, with both extreme ends of too much or too less, indicating a shift of the system's exchange towards overload or flat sameness. The performative research presentation thus intended to amplify ongoing interference reverberations before they become sedimentary and ingrained in planetary memory, to open an awareness for different ways of responsibility. In this sense, it was not just an indication towards hidden dialectics of inscription, but an attempt to hint at a possible otherwise. Robinson defines listening, which always entails responding, differently as critical listening positionality, that is, quote, a practice of guest listening, which treats the act of listening as entering into a sound territory, quote end, and thereby as a way to unsettle normative non-listening habits and abilities. Entering a different realm or territory of sounding needs to acknowledge a not knowing, or as the writer Emily Ogden puts it, in fact, of unknowing. She defines this not as a voluntary state of ignorance, but rather as the defenselessness of not knowing yet. In her interpretation, this entails a capacity to hold the position of not knowing yet, even possibly never reaching knowing. Noise therefore seems to offer an opportunity to take the interim position towards an unlearning, how something should sound. For Thompson, working like me within a culturally specific concept, largely reflective of a Eurocentric body of work, this means to unsettle connotations that fix, quote, noise as a type of sound or a value judgment that is made of sound, quote, end, to recognize noise as a perturbing force relation that, for better or worse, induces change. Noise thus offers an opening towards a space of not knowing yet, or perhaps never fully, comparable to Robinson's suggestion for guest listening, but accepts that something falls beyond the known frame of conceptualization, a framework of acceptance that respects also that which cannot fully be translated, but speaks its own tongue and comes with its own sounds. Thompson's insight that noise is an inextricable component of not just communication systems, but also material relations more generally, refers to Shannon and Weaver's information theories. As Thompson observes, this classical theory focuses on the correction of deviation to achieve the original message's reliability. Shannon and Weaver realized noise's contribution to the readability of the supposed signal and its potential to generate information. In their view, however, the selection of information is a measure of choice, considering that more information means more uncertainty and obscures which signal is the intended one, that directed their goal towards a desire to have mastery over noise. This attempt of mastery, enforced by a dichotomic setting of consistent in and exclusions, to what accounts for and what to negate, aims for a static once and for all situation that contradicts all generative and developmental systemic insights. While noise indeed can destroy or diminish the function of a system, it can also cause systems to reorganize with greater complexity and variety, increasing their capacity to act. This is a quote again from Marie Thompson. The tendency for sameness that Western metaphysics promotes through the exclusion and debasement of other conceptualizations of knowledge, as well as the idea of scientific progress, may be the real trigger that has ushered the planetary into the era of the Anthropocene. Cecile Manner-Spina defines, quote, increasingly paranoid forms of competitive self-renewal, end quote, also for Western scientific domains, which then only relate through the system's immanent leveling equivalence of commercial profitability. As a result, she considers noise as beneficial for epistemic domains since it increases variety while sustaining a certain degree of uncertainty. Instead of using fixation to manifest the system's internal redundancy, this should be used to, quote, create conceptual resonance able to sustain the transdisciplinary noise, quote, end. Indeed, this could serve as a blueprint for a broader framework that considers noise exchange across cultural systems, becoming transspecies and transplanetary in the process. In the terms of the project's understanding of noise as an experimental indicator of the unknown or ignored, amplified interference patterns emerging from movement interactions through the amplifying devices were considered as ways of communication that emerge from these interactions. Interference, therefore, provided the adequate expression of others for and by the effective impact on them, so these were regarded as responses, rather than solely to be seen as signaling a disturbance for what is chosen relevant for the dominant system, Western culture. Such switching of the perspective gives the sources some autonomy and ability to produce an awareness for these matters by sounding their own noise audibility. According to Robinson's understanding, listening into unknown realms entails the suspension of the belief, quote, in the certainty of knowing what the act of listening is, quote, end. The application of amplifying devices on humans and things alike prompted the realization that acknowledging one's own and other forms of interferences allows one to recognize that different variations of appearances do not exist solely for us, but that we become through and with them. The noisy experience of the plurivocal voicings within the performance experiment contributed importantly to this insight. A different attitude towards listening and then responding must pass through such messy states of no longer being sure what listening is, what to listen to, and how to read it, to effect a decolonial crisis in the act of listening. As Robinson points out, there is no easy, willful way to change these habits, as it rather means to shift, quote, the places, models, and structures of how we listen, quote, end. Responsibility, ability, and ability beyond the learned range of answering must take unlearning seriously by acknowledging paths for the yet indeterminate. Sounds, noisy sounds, ruptured visualizations, and unaccustomed moves transport such elements of the indeterminate and can enable a differing moment of experience. For most unlearning accepts that not understanding does not necessarily reduce the relevance of the heard, nor does it diminish the response and ability towards it. In the sense of Malaspina, I thus argue that accepting noise rather than eradicating it can enable a more balanced engagement with other matterings and their knowings. Unlearned listening to the reverberations of interferences in this sense of critical positionality is thus considered as a way of allowing these noises maybe to become sounds, to permeate and condense as a differing awareness that may be able to initiate a process of learning towards new common ways. Thank you very much.